Okay, everybody. Thank you so much again for being here. You're going to get very tired of seeing me by the end of this day. So welcome to panel 3. And while we're waiting for MS Redcherries to get back, I'll just do a quick introduction about this panel. And I also want to remind us, in these conversations that it's not my intentionality to present Indigenous poetry as a monolith. It is, or as a perfection, or it is a very complicated and beautifully varied conversation, and this is one fragment of it. And this particular fragment is about experimental poetry practices in Indigenous poetry, and our panelists. I'll give an introduction here now. We'll have MS Redcherries, who's received an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop and a JD from Arizona State University College of Law. She's a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne Nation. Her debut book, Mother, was a finalist for the National Book Award. And next to MS's DG, nanouk okpik, is a Inupiaq from Alaska. Okpik is the author of Blood Snow from Wave Books in 2022, which was a finalist for the 2023 Pulitzer Prize in Poetry, as well as Corpse Whale, University of Arizona Press, which won the American Book Award and the May Sarton Award. Okpik was a recipient of the Truman Capote Literary Trust Scholarship. And we'll also hear from Nicole Wallace, whose first chapbook, Wasamoan, was published by IMP. And is it IMP or IMP? IMP. It was published by IMP in 2019. I ask you this every time. I'm so sorry. Most recently, Nicole was the June-July 2020 Poetry Micro-Resident at Running Dog and a 2019 Poets House Emerging Poets Fellow. Recent work can be read in print in Survivance, Indigenous Poesis, Volume 4 zine, and online at Running Dog, A Perfect Vacuum, and Lit Hub. They have also contributed to programs and publications celebrating the work and life of the late poet Diane Burns, author of Riding the One-Eyed Ford, which we do have a copy of upstairs. And also, if there's, it's presented alongside a QR code, and if you scan the QR code, it'll take you to the digitized version of it, which is available on our website, with commentary by Nicole as well, an introduction. So definitely worth checking out. So this is in a way, there's a claim being made in this panel about poetry as an experimental process, and so. So in a way, also, I want to acknowledge the history of this symposium, because in 2013, I think Poets House hosted a symposium of Native poets called Native Innovation, and I think the framework of that is very similar to the framework of this conversation. So in a way, this is kind of a continuation, but it's also, I think, maybe a revision of that conversation as well, which we can get to. So to start, I asked each of the poets, as before, to come up with a poem or a poet they would want to talk about, and it could be a poem of their own or a poem of somebody else's. So shall we do that? Do people want to start? Do you want to start by sharing, MS, a poem, and then we can go just down the line?
Yeah. I literally just went through here and was like, what looks the most experimental? Whatever that means. I have a poem it's called New Mass. It looks like a traditional poem, but it has different sections and different forms. And I have nothing to say about why I chose to do that, except that it felt right. Do I read it? Okay. Yeah. Apart, this grass flower, I never did it right, it being the emerging rose wearing green. I see the world around me, and she is gray tinted on stacked bodies, and everywhere I see there's a car going fast. A car drives around me and we are close in air. If a mother I should become, I find myself saying, daughter, if I fall, let me. My God has many lovers. And when I got an envelope reading official U.S. government mail from the Department of the Interior, I thought my citizenship got revoked for being Indian, but it was just the government saying I now own 0.1478589 acres in Montana for my mother, along with the 0.5773363 acres I have in Oklahoma for my father. And the letter says, I am the victor, I wear the crown. My God has many lovers who say this world is special and yours is not. And the letterhead opens and eats itself, telling me Jesus is the answer of peace.
Thank you. So we'll talk a little bit more about why you chose that, but let's hear from DG next.
Hi, I would like to have Michael play. I chose a poem from Tracy K. Smith, who's not Native, but it is pertinent to my journey as a poet. And the reason for that is because I was adopted and I didn't know who I was from or where I was from in the beginning. So I looked to Black poets as a segue to my adventure and journey as a poet. And one of them was Tracy K. Smith, who I met some 20 years ago. And then she became poet laureate, and I then saw her again. And her words really inspired me. And one of those poems is a declaration that Tracy wrote. Next year will be the year for the birthday of the Declaration of Independence. And she wrote a poem that is under erasure using deconstructionism as a point in her journey. And it moved me, so that's why I chose it. And I'd just like to have that played now.
Declaration. He has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people. He has plundered our, ravaged our, destroyed the lives of our, taking away our, abolishing our most valuable, and altering fundamentally the forms of our. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here, taken captive on the high seas to bear.
And I'd like to elaborate on that. As a method of deconstructionism, she tries to undo in order to seek and display assumptions of the text, dismantling and creating tension. For me, that resonated. Under erasure, what will suffice? A strike-through or under erasure score creates simultaneous presence and absence. The word is both there and not there at the same time. Necessity versus inadequacy, and the word is used because there is no better alternative. But crossing it out acknowledges that no word perfectly captures the concept it tries to represent. A deconstruction tool of Deirdre and some of the deconstructionalists used the technique to reveal inherent instability of language and the limitations of meaning within that text. A visual and symbolic act, the strike-through or erasure, provides a visual representation of doubt and critique, promoting the reader to consider the word's origins, connotations, and multiple meanings. In Deirdre's words and language are, in a sense, under erasure because they are approximations of reality and never fully adequate. In the literary context, writers and artists and philosophers use this technique to create dialogue with existing texts, challenging the meanings embedded in the words and symbols. Erasure refers to the act of completely removing, destroying, or making something forgotten. A physical mark or a memory or under erasure uses a person's identity, history, and culture from public disclosure and representation. The concept extends the literary and social context where it describes the deliberate or systematic omission of certain individuals or groups leading to their marginalization and lack of acknowledgement. I'd like to leave it there.
Thank you, DG. So let's hear from Nicole. Nicole?
Hi, everyone. Rob mentioned in the introduction that I've done work around the late poet Diane Burns's poetry and her work. And so I would like to share this clip of her reading a poem called Alphabet City Serenade. The video is a part of a series called Poetry Spots that were filmed and produced by poet Bob Holman. And this clip, or I guess this video, is from 1989.
Once they built the railroad, the buffalo split past the horizon line. Once they built the railroad, now the railroad's done. Brother, can you front me a dime? I'm down and out in Low East Side. I'm out of smoke in Low East Side. I'm out of tea in Low East Side. I'm out of luck, I'm out of my mind. All at the same time in Low East Side. Oh, East Village, I. I'm American royalty, walking around with a hole in my knee. I'm a hopeful aborigine, trying to find a place to be. Oh, East Village, I. Back home now, I'd be at the powwow. I'd be drinking herb tea and eating deer meat. Maybe smooching in a blanket with a pot of water me. But here I am on Avenue D, a sacrifice, a manifest destiny. Oh, East Village, I'm not your stepping stone.
Hey man, can you spare a cigarette? Do you know of a place to sublet? Do you know where I could cash this check? Do you know that I hate Doris Day? I hate Chevrolet. I hate Norman Bates. I hate the United States. Oh, you want to talk about gentrification?
We do want to talk about gentrification. Do you want to talk about why you chose that, and then we'll go to MS as well.
Sure. Yeah. So Diane, she was Ojibwe from her family's from Lakota, and she's also Chemehuevi. And when I first heard about her work, it was probably in 2017 from my friend Sky Hopinka, and I was just really shocked and moved by Diane's work. I was like, I had my first experience, hearing the Ojibwe language and Louise Erdrich's writing when I was a kid, and then having been in New York for, I guess, 15 years at that point, and working at the Poetry Project, I had never encountered another Ojibwe poet that had lived in New York City, that was writing in the language. And then, of course, you can read more on Poets House website, but her book, Riding the One-Eyed Ford, had been out of print. It was published in 1981 for a long time, and it still is and remains so. But I was really moved by her work as somebody who was using the language, who had lived here, and there was a connection there as another Ojibwe person living in New York City who had just started to bring our language, Anishinaabe into my own writing. And, I was thinking about the musicality that comes up in Diane's work. She's this whole video is her critique on colonialism and manifest destiny and removal and displacement. And so I thought that felt pertinent for today's conversation, in addition to Poets House having so generously offered me the space to share her work online a few years ago.
Before we get to MS, I just wanted to say that this time around, as I've heard this video before, this time around I really heard the word but here I am on Avenue D. That's
the good part where they zoom into Avenue D.
Yeah, it's kind of a comic moment, but the word but makes it, I think, almost ominous as well. Yeah. Okay, go ahead. You want to talk a little bit about why you picked that particular piece? Yeah, a little bit more, I guess. You've already.
Yeah, I'm just going to take this. Yeah, I mean, my journey into poetry was kind of accidental. I wrote in the genre of fiction. I studied fiction. My MFA was in fiction, and then I found out that through the Western canon they call it poetry, and I really do resist, and I refuse to kind of act in the two genres, and so I'm very resistant to call my work experimental or to even call Indigenous poetics experimental, because I feel like there's been such a history of not misunderstanding Native poetics or Indigenous poetics, but for want of misunderstanding Native poetics. And I think when Native people are writing stories, it doesn't fit in the Western paradigm of fiction. Therefore, it has to be an errant. Therefore, it's not a narrative. It's not a true narrative and literary craft. And so they kind of push Native writers into the genre of poetry. And then if they don't understand our form, then we're called experimental poets. And so I think towing the line is really, Again, I don't really call my work experimental, but in the realm of fiction, I do believe it is. In poetry, I don't think it is. But for sake of this panel, in discussing what experimental poetics is, I suppose it's a play of form. I suppose it's maybe even visual. I hope maybe even bends not only genre, but disciplines. And I consider Mother a novella, a fictional novella. On one end of the spectrum, on the other end, I suppose it's an experimental poetry collection, or maybe experimental fiction, whatever that means. But my intent for reading the poem that I did is that it breaks form in many ways, and I've been asked about why I did that, and I don't really have a great question, except that I liked the engagement that it looks with the white space. I think I'm not a studied poet. I only have learned through intuition and reading other poets. The poets here are part of the symposium I've read, and so coming to it in kind of an organic sense, breaking form. That's why I chose it.
I'm so glad that we're already talking about what experiment, quote unquote, means, and maybe pushing back against that. It's something that I feel the least equipped to talk about as well, in a very similar reason, for similar reasons that I've come to poetry in a very kind of intuitive way, and that it's not that the work can be, seen as experimental without it being felt as experimental from a compositional point of view. But I'd love to hear from everyone else too about what that means to you, and maybe the sort of schools around experimental poetry. And maybe Nicole, you've got some experience there as through the project. But
yeah, I mean, I was thinking about preparing for today, and I was like, what is experimental poetry? And having been at the Poetry Project since 2007, I guess the organization represents the schools of experimental poetry, but what are those? I don't know. for me, it was really coming across other poets who I could read that I wasn't taught in high school and asked to understand things in a specific way. That poetry could be more of a conversation. It didn't have to be this formal thing that you read and you're like, okay, I have to assign meaning to everything. And I think for me, I think a lot about, or I guess when I'm writing or in general, when I'm reading poetry, which I prefer to hear read by other people before I read it on the page. There's something about people's voice and breath and the way that they share the work that, to me, resonates or registers with me in that way, in a better way. But I think for me, reading poetry is an experience of feeling through or moving through people's experiences and descriptions that they're bringing forward, and it doesn't have to be assigned a specific meaning. So when I'm writing or thinking about my writing, that's how I approach it. Not, I guess, through it like experimental lens. It just kind of has become what it's become. But yeah, I still don't really know what experimental poetry is. Like, it's usually stuff that gets published by small presses and goes out of print, like this book. And yeah, that's what I got.
Did you have any thoughts?
I think experimental poetry for me, I have a rigorous writing discipline that I do every day. I read and write 4 to 6 hours every day. And for me, learning from Malcolm X about the dictionary, he was incarcerated and learned to read and write by using the dictionary every day and taking the words from the dictionary and transcribing them on the page and learn each word. And that's what I do every day. I look in the dictionary, I use it as a tool. It's a tool for me. It's my place I go to feel safe, because I'm learning and I'm playing with words and I'm using it as an experiment for my own learning to share with others. And to my poems come to me very much in dream states. Regularly, they come to me in dream states, and I don't know always where I'm going in the poem. The poem then finds me in that experiment and that play with word and that pun, that playfulness, and that word choice. And that's always been very important.
Thank you. I was in on a residency a couple months ago, and people were talking about the avant-garde and like, what is the avant-garde? Is there an avant-garde anymore? And what does that even mean? And I had no answer because I had no sense of it. But part of the for me, the part of the conceit of an avant-garde is a positioning away from some kind of standard, which in a way, I mean, and in America, in the American project, to use Joan's phrase, is the standard is whiteness. The standard is Eurocentrism. The standard are received forms from often English language traditions. So in that context, how do you think of indigeneity as a kind of as an other pushing against those kinds of traditions?
I think the space, the liminal space in between both, really accentuates the breaking down of language, the deconstruction of language, and being able to take the colonized word choice and then bending it, twisting it, subverting the dominant paradigm and flipping it upside down to where it works for me and it works for others as they read it in a way that is, in my sense of the line, is broken syntax and flipping that syntax upside down. And it comes naturally. So when I write, it comes in that voice of breaking down and deconstructing.
Yeah, absolutely. We can also go off script too and talk about whatever we want to talk about as well. I mean, I'm so interested, MS, in how you were more willing to call yourself an experimental fiction writer than an experimental poet. Is that no? Is that?
I don't know. Maybe I accidentally said that. I take it back. I think I'm just a writer. I don't know. I consider myself just a writer, and I think it's a privilege to write. And I think there's a responsibility to it as an Indigenous person. Kind of like I'm thinking about the panel before about like asserting your sovereignty and like through the act of actually sharing stories. I think that's a responsibility. I think there's certain duties that you were given, or gifts that you were given to help your community. And I think as a poet, maybe that's our gift, and that comes with a lot of thought. What do you even put on the page as coming from a culture where we didn't transcribe our stories, we held them and we told them, and those stories are timeless. And I think poetry is, when I say I'm an accidental poet, maybe I've always been a poet by Western standards, because I think in a way poetry does allow for this timelessness of storytelling. You can break form, you can speak in, there's many speakers. In fiction, everyone's like, who's the narrator, who's speaking, what POV is this? But I think with poetry, there's a freedom, and I think maybe an experimental essence that's not allowed in fiction writing. But I think I'm not a native speaker. I didn't grow up speaking Cheyenne. I know very, very important words and meanings to those words, but I don't write in Cheyenne. And in many ways, I feel like the responsibility of writing in English on the page is to almost subvert. I like criticizing America. It's one of my favorite things. Come talk to me about it. But I'd like to think that me writing in English is almost absconding the English language and turning it back against the colonizers so they can understand. Yeah, that's what I'd like to think.
Yeah, I guess I hear avant-garde and I'm like, oh, I don't know. It's too fancy for me. So I apologize for kind of like sounding out there. But I guess when I was thinking about what I wanted to bring today, and then I was thinking about Diane's work, and I was thinking about how I write, and then I was thinking back to Gerald Visner, and you were talking about having experiences, like poetic experiences as you're dreaming, and that's a part of your process. And so I brought this book. I brought some friends with today, but it's Anishinaabe Nagamon, which has a reinterpretation that Gerald Visner did of our songs. So there's like dream songs in here, song poems, and a lot of these had glyphs that were written on our Bridgeburg scrolls. It's a really beautiful book. And I guess maybe I'll just read my favorite one really quick because it's fun to hear them. Let's see here. Sound of thunder. Sometimes I pity myself while the wind carries me across the sky, across the earth, everywhere, making my voice heard. So I was thinking about this book, and then I was thinking about Marcy Rendon's new book, Anishinaabe Songs for a New Millennium, which she uses this interpretation of the dream songs and other songs that Gerald Visner put out to write her own. And yeah, I think in thinking about my relationship to writing, to me it feels like I find a lot of inspiration from other Anishinaabe writers and poets, and to be able to find these connections across time that feel like an extension to the present that I am holding on to and bringing into my own work when I'm thinking about writing feels really important. And I had read, you did an interview with Poets House, and you were talking about the space of a page as a way of moving through breath and time.
Yes.
And I'm curious to hear more about that from your perspective.
I think moving through breath and time for me is, time is constant. Time is like a cork hitting a proton, hitting another cork, hitting another cork, and it's a movement at all times. And I think of language as being alive, and it's very present in our daily lives when we speak to each other. But on the page, it needs to keep moving and having that energy on the page to move. And when I think of poetry for me and that time and space, it's through that dream state or that altered state that I can find the musicality and the lyricism in the work that needs to be there. And it comes through that space in between, that space that is pushing, resisting, pulling apart, being molded into something new, to make something new of the work and creating a new song. And that's kind of where I live.
That's beautiful. How do the other folks on the panel think about the page as a compositional element, or think about breath, or think about just the compositional process in general?
I have to say, in Inupiaq, we have the breath soul in the wind, and that is poetry, the breath soul in the wind. So when I think of the ways that things come to me, it's like I'm a hollow bone and a conduit, and those words go through me. They're not mine to own. They're not mine to own as my own. They're the world's, they're the universe, they're the breath of the soul and the spirit. And that's where I find poetry always most effective.
Mm.
Yeah, just to kind of go off of what DG just said, there are people in our communities, especially Indigenous writers, who I feel like are who are seers, like they're speaking from a plane or an existence beyond us, maybe in the future and the past, but it's almost like the work is a vehicle of knowledge and kind of this new understanding of creating song or creating stories, which I think is, like I said earlier, a responsibility of someone to do. And I think going back to Bonnie said earlier in the panel about this individualization of writing in this industry and publishing. You know, we write stories, but they're not our stories, but, you know, we have to publish as our name, right? And I think that's it can get a little icky and a little strange, because people ask you, where do these ideas come from? And I don't have a name, or they're not mine. Similarly, I personally feel that I have been given a lot of opportunity in ways that many Native people haven't, and my family, and that's a responsibility in itself. And I think everyone who came before me, I think my family, you know, people say I can write stories. You should hear my uncle, you should hear my brother, you should hear my sister. And in many ways they're here with me. And people do say, like, you carry with you, your family and your people. And I think as a Native writer, you have to, and that's a responsibility. But I think, someone has to create new songs. Someone has to be this vehicle of those moments that you have to transcribe them as a page being compositional. It's kind of what in the video that we looked at earlier in the first panel, where the elder said that, the page is two-dimensional, but the what's on the page is actually three-dimensional. It's I think when you transcribe an oral story onto the page, it can't even, it's one-dimensional. It's so beyond the page. And so capturing an entire moment or an entire memory or story is beyond the page. I think someone has to tell it to you. I think it's in the body. I think it's in the seerness of the storyteller. And so I look at stories as living things, as things that are constantly evolving. Like I said, this timeless nature. And I think when you put it on the page, it becomes this artifact or like this moment that's captured in a way that it shouldn't be. And so I see, my writing as something that's just, it makes it accessible to someone who wants to read it on an airplane or like in the room privately. But I think the moments that I wish could be captured can only be told as I'm speaking them, or as I'm telling them, or as someone else is speaking them or telling them. So compositionally, I really don't. I just think of it as like a written record or something.
Mm-hmm. Nicole?
Yeah, I guess, like, I'm not sure where to pick up because I'm having a lot of thoughts. But just to go back to the process of composition, I usually work on a typewriter. There's something to me when I am able to feel the physicality of the words being put down and the spacing on the page. It's really helpful for me. It slows my mind down, as opposed to working in like a document on a computer where you can easily erase and get rid of things. And I also, I feel like I've thought a lot about space in my work and the breaking of lines and movement on the page. And for like lack of a better way to describe it, I've thought of it as a score for my reading or breath or movement. And so that's how I have worked on composing my poems. My next chapbook is called a nungonsag, and that takes a different form. I've been working on these like small graph paper sheets and typing on them as a way of creating more space. I might turn the page after each line. And what kind of inspired that was that, when you're like taking notes and then you're like moving lines around and you have to scribble all over stuff. I was like, well, why don't I just write this line this way here and then write it the other way here? And so if I change my mind or want to change the poem or the story, I could easily replace that line with something else that I've written that's kind of the same or related, or maybe that's a line or a fragment that goes into another poem or story that I want to tell in my work. So
that's beautiful. One of the things that I was thinking about, I mentioned the Native Innovation symposium that happened here a while ago, and one of the things that discomforts me about that title or about that is framework is the idea that there. Because it seems that it's positional. The phrase innovation, it seems that it's like a legitimizing, like it's we're having this because innovation is some kind of special thing. But innovation also seems to me as a rejection of the past, and so which seems very non-Indigenous to me. So I don't know if you're interested in talking about futurity as a non-oppositional force to the past. I'm interested in how our poetries inhabit both a historicity, but also a futurity, if that makes sense. And I'm just completely rejecting the framework of experiment at this point and just talking about. So let's just go with it.
Well, was the question again?
It's kind of about the title of this gathering, which is past, present, and future, and how our poetries, kind of inhabit that, and the way that I was thinking about when I was putting this whole gathering together was thinking in multi-generational frameworks too, because it's there's no. Survivance is such an important part of our we're here because of survivance, and so I guess I was thinking about how do we inhabit a future without rejecting the past in our poetry.
I don't know if we can, because we have ancestors, and those stories are passed down through many different ways, but our ancestors and the history of poetry itself being written by the canon, or being written by many voices and many peoples that are multiracial, that the stories come from, we say, at the beginning of time in our ways, time memorial, and those stories are carried through oral tradition, and then writing them on the page is almost negating that oral tradition and bringing in documentation to where it does become a living fossil record of the past. And how do you discuss with the past presently in your work? And for me, I go to I've been to the explorers' diaries of the colonial spoken word, and diaries of their own experiences, and then I take it in, and then I go home, or I ask my auntie or ask my relative, does this sound true to you? Is this pertinent? Does this work? Is this how it was said? And then they can then say yay or nay. We don't say it like that. Maybe we say it this way. And then from there, I'll take the words and then bring it to the page and make it new. So it is a living body of work of all of those past, present, future. In the Inupiaq way, we think about time as not a linear form, but as a cluster form in the universe, where time and space are in circular motions, but they are not linear. So we're not looking back at things, and we're not looking forward to things. We are in the present and living here and now. And I think that's where I try to be in my writing.
I was thinking about what you were saying, MS. It feels weird to call you that. My good friend. I was thinking about what you were talking about, like hearing the stories that our families tell us and listening. And I grew up, my parents separated when I was really young, and I'm Native. I'm Ojibwe on my dad's side. I mostly grew up with my non-Indigenous mom, and I didn't grow up like in wider community. I didn't grow up doing cultural things. I didn't grow up learning the language. My dad didn't know the language and was even separated from culture. I mean, we had like pan-native art you can buy, like whatever, in the 90s in our house. And when, I feel like that's, the result of colonization and assimilation tactics. My grandpa was a part of removal and moved to Chicago when he was 17, and my great-grandma went to several different boarding schools, and my grandpa lost the language. It wasn't passed down to my dad, wasn't passed down to me. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about my work now, as I've, become close with my dad's side of the family again, my grandpa and his siblings and my cousins, and have gotten to experience that. A big pain for me being a younger person was not knowing like where I came from and what that actually meant, who my family is. They were like, you know, I like to read and write. My mom's family didn't, you know, like where is that coming from? And then my Auntie Bonnie, my grandpa's sister, she is a writer, and my cousins are learning the language. And I think I was thinking a lot about my niece who was born. She just turned 4, and being responsible for this new younger person in our lives, and how I never wanted her to be in the same position I was when I was younger. So I've been writing this poem called Inheritance, which reframes our history as a family through the lens of my experiences, but also the collective experiences of our family, in order to point to the present and, you know, what she can take forward, and now my nephew can take forward, and even my younger brothers. So I feel like that is the responsibility. It's a responsibility, and I feel like through my work I'm able to do that.
I think my responsibility is, again, being adopted. I am part of the story. My voice is important, and all of our voices are important, because we both and we all are part of the story. And so for my responsibility is, how do I hone the language and meld it and make it something that is pertinent for today? I keep going back to that notion of present, but I think that being present and making it new then creates a space for new things to come and new voices to arise. And by sharing that with other adopted people or children, I've worked as a case manager and an educator, even a dorm mother at the Santa Fe Indian School for many, many years. And one part of my journey was to give the kids a journal and a dictionary and see what they come up with. And they came up with magnificent pieces, and some were adopted and some weren't. And the melding of the two then created a new song, and that's part of my responsibility with the kids, is to work in that in-between space of both worlds, or maybe say one world.
You know, that's so powerful what both of you shared, actually, and really relevant to my story, which is also a story of adoption and removal, and sort of, and it made me think about, again, abandoning experimental poetry as a framework, but it made me think about the way that our bodies and our families and our presence in this world are the results of these forces, you know, that we had nothing to do with, and that are genocidal forces and institutions that are built to foster assimilation and to create disconnection in our community and in our families and in our culture, and so therefore our poetry then becomes an growth of that as well. And for me, very specifically, I had to learn a different kind of poetics in order to tell that part of the story, and also to sort of understand my own belonging in that story. So I guess turning it back to poetics, you know, what are your strategies in that way?
I explicate poems. I look at poems word by word, breath by breath, letter by letter, punctuation by punctuation, and I do it daily. So it is a part of going into the dictionary, taking the word, breaking it apart, building it back up, and then looking at the word. When I when I in my first year of poetry, I found out I found a book in the library, and it was the Inupiaq Dictionary, and I didn't know that my auntie was a linguist at University of Alaska Fairbanks, and that book jumped off the shelf for me to find. And when I did, I took that book and learned it and learned every word. In college, I did a independent study with my language when they told me I had to learn French or Salish or Kootenai. And I said, no, I want to learn my language. And I didn't know what that language was at the time, but I had this dictionary, and I used it as a tool. And then comparing it to the English dictionary, I was able to break down those language possibilities and make it my own. So it is a complete resonance of my family's history, with my auntie writing the dictionary and the vocabulary and grammar book and tapes. And part of the process was that I stumbled upon it. It was chance, an opportunity, and I took that chance and then learned my language through independent study for 4 years. It was very powerful then for me to have that responsibility of not knowing how to read the language, but being able to verbally speak it. And then now, as I'm older, I'm learning the language again and again and again through our dictionary from home and our speakers from home.
Thank you.
It's really interesting. We have 3. I'm adopted too, so I think the panel should have been called experiential poetry.
Oh yeah, experiential poetry. Okay. Actually, it was just a typo.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my practice, or like my understanding of poetry, is that there's a freedom to write and for the words to allow the space that it needs, whether it's a word and then one word and then all else is white space, or an erasure poem. There's this kind of like freedom to talk to the you, to address, maybe not even in the epistolary, but the concepts in a way that I think other genres or ways are more difficult or more misunderstood or abstract. And I think in poetry, when I was writing the sections, which I call just vignettes, and then I was told that they were poems, I think it was finding that freedom through poetry, and I was very honored to be a poet and called a poet, only because I feel like poetry is high art in a way that fiction isn't, that prose isn't. I respect poetry, and I'm very respectful of the form. I believe I am. I try to be. But yeah, I think engaging, speaking to concepts or ideas. Yeah.
I was thinking about DG, the way you were talking about looking at the dictionary and pulling apart language and learning the Anishinaabe language, which I feel like is going to take me my entire life. I'll never become a fluent person. But to be able to spend more time with the words, that was part of the reason why I wanted to bring it into my work, instead of just having these kind of like, online classes where they give you like, worksheets and things like that. And it's a way of becoming fluent, or like learning some level of fluency in the language. But then in Ojibwe language, our words are made up of fragments, and each fragment has a meaning. And so when you start to understand or try to understand, right? And I wasn't born speaking the language, so my experience is different than a first speaker, but pulling apart these word fragments and really spending time with them to understand the meaning, you can start to see how certain words are translated in our dictionary. And I think that kind of moving my learning out of the classroom or outside of like Language Table, which has been something that's been available now online since the pandemic had started in 2020, which I've learned a lot from. It's been another way of like engaging with the language in kind of like a slower, more I guess like intimate way, for lack of a better word. And yeah, I was just thinking about that when you mentioned that.
I'll ask this question and then turn it over to the audience. But I was really interested. I'm going to kind of circle back to MS, your idea of using English as almost like a language of resistance, and it reminded me of actually Louise Erdrich last summer at the INEPO retreat was talking about this a little bit, about indigenizing the language as well. And I used to think so tomorrow, tomorrow is 40%, roughly 40% now kind of derived from Spanish, and I used to think that meant it was 40% gone, kind of 40% extinct. But now, after hearing that, I think now that it's it's kind of coming back into the colonial language and taking it back a little bit and re-indigenizing that. So I guess I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts about that, or maybe you could talk a little bit more about your thinking around that with the English language.
Yeah, I mean, one of my really great friends, she's a poet in Santa Fe, and she encouraged me. She said the most important part of decolonizing is learning your language, right? And I am not a fluent speaker. Like I said, I only know certain words, but I think that's more of a testament of America's doing. And I just feel like if America was so determined to have generations lose language, and for America to be the dominant language, and for cultures to disappear because of language speakers also journeying on, then I'll teach you the words that you taught me. And I'll say them back to you. And that's my way of moving through the world. And I think some of it is rooted in the sadness that I have, that I don't have knowledge of my language. And, I don't, whose fault is that? And I believe it's America's fault. Yeah.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to add to that at all? So I'd like to turn things over to the audience if they would have any questions. And again, I'd also like to invite our audience from the online community to put some questions in the chat if you feel like it. So anybody have any questions? And it looks like Kim has a question. So I'm going to go ahead and also give up my microphone so that the questions can be heard.
First, I just want to say, Chimi Gretsch, it's just so inspiring to hear you talk about certain things, and, to really kind of show us your heart in that way. And I wanted to just touch back at some of the things that I thought were so important that kind of lead into my question. So I really love, DG, when you said, I think of myself as a hollow bone. I wrote that down because it's just fascinating to me. And then I loved what you said, Michaela, about people in our community being seers. And I think that's absolutely true. And sometimes we're afraid of that word or afraid of that role. And so I'm really glad that you mentioned that. And Nicole, of course, Visner. And, you know, I really love that you pull forward these writers that have been so instrumental to us. And I also really appreciated, you didn't say this specifically when you were talking about your process, but I remember watching you when we were here in the summer and the way that you performed your poems with those little pieces of paper. And I wondered, does she shuffle them? You know, how does she order them? Because that also connects up with what Michaela was saying about the poem on the page being sort of static and not, but the poem itself is alive, right? So all of that is a part of something that has preoccupied me for a long time. And that is, oh wait, one more thing. I had Rob's phrase, which I thought was just so beautiful. He said, he asked you to talk about futurity as a non-oppositional path. And I love that because here's the thing. For so long, I feel like the way the educational system works and the way the criticism works, Joan was talking about criticism prior, and I think it's important for us to think about that. But there's this phrase from Harold Bloom, the anxiety of influence. And I have been attacking that phrase my whole career because I feel like it's ridiculous because the idea is that you kill off the influences so that you stand as an individual writer, right? And I have always said that that's not the case in Indigenous writing, that instead we have a celebration of influence. And I loved that you just demonstrated that. But my question finally, after all of that preamble, is, could you also just say, I mean, Joy talked about our poetry ancestors too when she had that project when she was poet laureate. Could you talk about more of your I just love to hear people's influences. So could you talk more about your poetry ancestors?
I think my ancestors, when I found out that I was a Nupiaq, and my ancestors then became what I found in journals and documents that I researched in the library and in historical records and these important documents. And what I found was that they were coming to me naturally, and I didn't have any control over that. They just came. In the same way that words come on the wind, and that words are part of that hollow bone, to where that bone is the conduit for those words to seep through or to go through the wind. And that always has kept me grounded as a writer or seeker of words and love of logos, love of words.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe circle back to the futurity conversations. I've kind of been thinking about it as a form of legitimizing our history and our futures. I think I just encourage all Native people in this room to know that we have come from histories and we have stories that have ensured our survival and ensured that our culture exists. And in the present day, we now have to exist in this publishing industry, in the current industry, and we seek legitimization of our stories and the way that they're interpreted by the outside world. But we're here for, I believe that Native people, we write to give back to our communities. And so the only people that we should maybe be answering to is our communities and our people back home, and honoring these stories and ensuring our survival for the future. And I think that's why it's really important for this symposium to come around, and I'm really looking forward to the day tomorrow to speak privately with every writer and discuss the future and what we can do as we've been given these gifts and these stories. What can we do to ensure our visibility, ensure our survival, ensure our sanctity of the stories? And I think that's why we have all these questions, and we're trying to compromise different value systems at once in the publishing industry. And I think all of these questions some of them can't be compromised. Kind of just the individualistic nature of writing a story versus it coming from a place of a seer. Maybe you are a vehicle for those stories. And transcribing them onto a page was, I believe, an act of archival, an act to ensure that our stories survived because our people weren't surviving. And I think reconciling that's difficult because, the static nature of writing down a story that maybe is timeless and should only be shared to people in your community, that's difficult to kind of figure out. How do you do that? How do you honor the stories that you feel like you want to tell, but you can only tell them on the page? I don't, and I think these questions, I don't know the answers to, but I'm really looking forward to maybe answering them tomorrow with you guys. But poetry influences ancestors. I don't, probably my mother. I mean, she just from stories that I've heard from her and my family. And my uncle is a poet. His name's Merlin Redcherries. He wrote a poem to Nelson Mandela in prison when he was in prison, and Nelson wrote him back. Wow. That's cool. Yeah, he has it like taped on his wall. It's cool.
Yeah, I guess I've named a few of my poetry ancestors or poets that have shaped my experience as a writer and as a person, and to think even outside, more expansively outside of ancestors, but like living people and forms that are outside of poetry, whatever poetry is. I think a lot about, as I said, like a lot of other Anishinaabe writers inspire me, Kim being one, and Hyde, and even Haley Kirkwood, who's around my age, and they're also a descendant of Fond du Lac, where my family is from, and we're not related. We figure that out. But I think a lot about people who are bringing in the language, and I also, I brought up my Aunt Bonnie, and she writes, and she keeps a lot of it to herself now. But she's the storyteller in our family. So whenever I get to go home and visit them, her and my cousin and I will sit up around the table, and she'll tell us stories about growing up or becoming older, like moving to Minneapolis from Fond du Lac. And it's, sometimes she'll repeat the same story in a different year. And it's so nice to have that time to absorb the stories about our family, but also ways of telling stories. And so I wanted to say that, and also thinking about a lot of the people who have done language revitalization work, thinking about Anton Troyer specifically. He had this journal, or he was the editor of a journal. I'm forgetting the name of it right now. What was that? Oshkobewas. Thank you, Kim. And how that worked was he had went around to elders and first speakers who were alive and recorded them telling stories, and then those stories were then put into Anishinaabe language based on the transcript, and then he would transcribe those into English. So you have a lot of different ways of experiencing the language, but it is a way of directly hearing these stories from our elders. And I think that's really impacted the way I think about language learning and storytelling too.
Okay, so let's hear it we'll leave it there for now, and let's a round of applause for our panelists, Nicole Wallace, DG nanouk, okpik, and MS Redcherries. And so we're going to take a short break. We'll reconvene back here at 4 p.m. for a panel discussion more explicitly on a subject that we've been talking a lot about, reclamation, empowerment, and repair. It'll be me, Lou Cornum, and Tasia Tsidi. So please join us at 4. Thanks again.
And to hear your perspective on